Welcome to this virtual lecture this evening and the kickoff of the residency at Kenyon College of the group Theater of War. And it's my pleasure this evening to be able to introduce the co-founder of Theater of War, Bryan Doerries, class of '98, honorary degree 2017. When thinking about Theater of War and thinking about this introduction today, I was reflecting on a quote from James Baldwin on the power and the meaning of art and literature in our lives. And Baldwin wrote in an essay that art has to be kind of a confession. I don't mean a true confession in the sense of that Drury magazine. The effort, it seems to me, is this. If you can examine and face your life, you can discover the terms with which you are connected to other lives, and they discover them too, the terms with which they are connected to other people. This has happened to every one of us, I'm sure. You read something which you thought only happened to you, and you discovered it happened 100 years ago to Dostoevsky. This is a very great liberation for the suffering, struggling person who always thinks they are alone. That is why art is important. And indeed, I'm excited this year about the collaboration between Kenyon and Theater of War, because I do think that this company speaks to so very much of the heart of why the liberal arts were important and why the study of arts and humanities are important. Theater of War is a production company that presents dramatic readings of seminal plays from Greek tragedies to modern and contemporary works. And these are followed by town hall style discussions that are designed to confront social issues by engaging in and revealing personal reactions to the themes that are highlighted in the plays. In other words, theater becomes, in Baldwin's terms, great liberation for the suffering, struggling person who always thinks they are alone. Theater of War has developed plays and conversations around themes of war and mental health, racism and social justice, domestic violence, refugees and immigration, among many others. And the company has collaborated with a wide range of organizations, from the Department of Defense to veterans organizations and advocacy groups, to prisons, homeless shelters, hospitals, and activist groups all over the country. This isn't the first visit of Bryan and Theater of War to Kenyon. In 2017, the company presented Tape, a dramatic reading of a play to engage in discussions about rape and sexual consent. Bryan graduated from Kenyon in 1998. He was a classics major, and he's the author of the book Theater of War. What ancient Greek tragedy can teach us today? So it's just my pleasure to introduce Bryan. So Bryan, thank you for being with us, and looking forward to having you with us all year.
Thank you so much, President Decatur. It's an honor to be with you and with everyone in the Kenyon community tonight. I'm going to deliver prepared remarks. I have about an hour of remarks to get through, and then we're going to open up the floor to discussion. And just the ground rules are simply during the discussion about an hour from now, if you want to engage with us and raise your hand, you can use the raise your hand function at the bottom of your screen. We'll come to that a little bit later. But good evening. As President Decatur mentioned, my name's Bryan Doerries, and I'm a proud Kenyon alumnus and a former classics major and the artistic director of Theater of War Productions. And we're a small but nimble media company that presents live performances of seminal, often ancient texts for diverse audiences all over the world to catalyze and frame guided discussions about some of the most pressing issues of our time. And I'm honored and so excited to launch our one-year-long virtual residency at Kenyon with this lecture, which I've entitled Tragedies for the Pandemic. For the last decade, Theater of War Productions has presented thousands of readings and performances of plays by Sophocles, Aeschylus, Euripides, Shakespeare, Eugene O'Neill, Tennessee Williams, and sermons by Dr. Martin Luther King, speeches by Frederick Douglass, Japanese no plays from the 15th century, and poems ranging from ancient Hebrew texts to the poetry of American nurses working on the front lines in a variety of seemingly unlikely places, such as homeless shelters, hospitals, prisons, jails, military bases, Title I schools, public housing community centers, hospitals, halfway houses, senior centers, public parks, and most notably, the Pentagon, Rikers Island, Fukushima, Japan, the detention camps in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, the stage at Normandy High School just outside of Ferguson, Missouri, from which Michael Brown Jr. graduated. Edinburgh Castle, a basketball court in Brownsville, Brooklyn, sandwiched between housing projects, a library in Hazard, Kentucky, ground zero of the opioid epidemic in Appalachia, a megachurch in Joplin, Missouri, where an EF5 tornado killed 166 people in 32 minutes and destroyed over 7,000 homes, a tent on an army base in Kuwait at the Iraq border, a veterans hospital in the Netherlands, a business school in Copenhagen, the Mayo Clinic, Lincoln Medical Center, a public hospital in the Bronx that was nearly brought to its knees by COVID in April, the Manhattan DA's courtroom, the officers' quarters at Colchester Barracks, home of the UK's parachute regiment, the Audubon Ballroom where Malcolm X was assassinated, a street corner in Red Hook, Brooklyn, where residents of two rival housing projects sometimes meet on neutral ground, the St. Louis Children's Hospital, the Tillery Street Women's Shelter, and the Women's War Memorial at Arlington Cemetery, just to name a few. And everywhere we've gone, we've heard the most powerful, insightful, life-changing things spoken about the ancient myths and texts we perform by individuals and communities who've lived lives of mythological proportions, who've faced the stakes of life and death, who've tackled the most challenging aspects of humanity, who've been betrayed, and who know the meaning of sacrifice. It's our contention that these are their stories. They belong not to those of us who were privileged enough to study them in the ivory tower, but to audiences in the trenches with something at stake for whom every word may be of life and death significance. With reverence for what these audiences know, by virtue of their proximity to suffering, we contend that they have more to teach us than we to teach them. And so our work is about what happens when we as storytellers approach our craft with humility and the fundamental belief that the audience always knows more than we do. What new things are possible when we cease to regard ourselves as the authorities, the shamans, blessing our initiates with the gift of culture, and we see that we are the initiates, and that the audience is in the position of blessing us with its presence, its insights, its ability to make connections to things that we cannot see, its collective knowledge, its power to communalize and bear witness to trauma, its capacity to heal. Now, I'd just like to take a moment to acknowledge that 15 years ago, if someone had told me that watching an ancient Greek play and talking about it could be a matter of life and death, I would say that sounds hyperbolic and grandiose and frankly ridiculous. And yet, I cannot begin to share with you the stories of the countless people who've come up to me and to my colleagues and to the actors who work with us after performances to say things like, "That play touched me deeply. It was the first time my spouse spoke to me about the war. The first time I saw my father cry. The first time I understood my grandparents' silence. I saw myself in the character and checked myself into a 28-day drug and alcohol treatment program the next morning. I was thinking about taking my own life and sought help. I was thinking about taking the lives of others and told someone. I was experiencing domestic violence in my home and I just made an appointment to get help. The play saved my family. The play saved my life." Knowing that live performances have the capacity to reach people and open them up in these ways has come with immense responsibility. One of the questions at the center of our work is, once audiences are open, well, what next? What can we achieve, especially around divisive issues with diverse audiences, with divergent viewpoints and perspectives that wasn't possible before we performed the plays? With so many people and corporations and governments and movements and political parties and religious institutions, advertisers trying to divide us, it turns out that live performance and discussion in the potential complexity and depth of the exchange that it can elicit is the answer to the 280 character limit of Twitter. Back in 2008, when we got started, it was seen as a career-ending gesture in the US military to raise your hand and say, "I'm struggling with an invisible wound." But as our first performance of Theater of War demonstrated, we could perform readings of scenes from Sophocles, Ajax, and Philoctetes, two ancient plays about warriors struggling to maintain their dignity and honor during the Trojan War, and get audiences of Marines and their spouses to talk about their experiences at war, returning from war by way of these ancient plays. Over the years, I've heard a lot of military veterans say things like, "I talk about my experience with civilians or those who don't share them, but it just takes so much goddamn energy." The ancient plays we perform provide a vocabulary and a pretext for speaking the unspeakable, while juicing the room with psychic and emotional energy, all the while normalizing the extreme emotions on display in the stories, moving back the walls of the space and saying to the audience, the actors have already gone to these extremes, you might as well meet us halfway. And that's what audiences do. After an early performance of Theater of War in Deerfield, Massachusetts, a Vietnam War era nurse stood up in front of the audience and said, if you can hear the play, then you can hear my story, and went on to recount her experiences caring for young men in Vietnam, things she'd never before shared in public. Now, short of giving everyone in the room a psychotropic drug, I doubt you'll ever see 1,000 soldiers or Marines, frontline medical providers, corrections officers, inmates, gang-affiliated youth, or survivors of natural disaster, domestic violence, political violence, or racialized violence open up in this way. And so we must acknowledge that theater, and ancient theater in particular, is a mind-altering, conscious-expanding technology, a tool for transformation and healing developed by a highly militarized democracy and born out of the necessity of communalizing trauma during a century in which the Athenians who invented it saw nearly 80 years of war, a century in which a plague, now believed to be typhoid fever, killed nearly 1/3 of the Athenian population. These tragedies of war and pestilence and civil unrest speak with increasing urgency to the present moment of characters learning too late, usually by milliseconds, to avert disaster, destroying themselves and people they love and generations to come. Now, for most of my life, I believed, as I imagine most of you do today, what I learned in school, namely that Greek tragedy is the supreme expression of pessimism by a fatalistic society that depicts a universe in which we humans barely apprehend the forces at work upon us: chance, fate, luck, habit, government, gods, genetics, until it's too late, and we've unwittingly slipped and made an irreversible mistake. And while this is in fact what happens in Greek tragedies on the stage, why would a people, no matter how cynical or fatalistic, gather together, close to 1/3 of the Athenian population, for 3 consecutive days each spring to watch plays about characters with reasonably good and noble intentions who learn of their mistakes too late and suffer wretchedly for them? What good could possibly come from such an exercise, day after day, play after play, unless there was a difference, one we've missed for millennia, between what happened on stage and its effect on the audience? What if tragedy is a form of storytelling that was designed not to send us home to wallow in our misery or in the fragility or futility of human existence, but to wake us up to the slim possibility of human agency, of making a choice that averts imminent disaster before it's too late? The principal experiment of the 20th century, theater and cinema, which I'm afraid we've yet to dispense with, has been the wholesale silencing and erasure of the audience by plunging it into darkness and acculturating and policing it to stifle not only speech, but even coughs, sneezes, and yawns, and yes, most recently, the vibrations and sounds of cell phones, as if to draw attention to ourselves in a theatrical setting were some kind of violation of a sacred law, cardinal sin for which we should be expelled, even excommunicated for having committed. At least in the 19th century, audiences could express themselves by throwing tomatoes at the stage. But now we, as audience members, are relegated to expressing ourselves in highly legislated ways, typically after being assaulted by a swarm of officious people on their way into the theater, brandishing clipboards and walkie-talkies, all telling us how to behave and when to use the bathroom and when late seating will take place, and if there will be a discussion afterwards, typically called in theatrical parlance a talkback, as if, as an audience member speaking back out of turn, you would be committing an act of gross insubordination before being subsumed by darkness and kept in the shadows for the duration of the performance, at the end of which we are then invited for a brief moment to make noise by clapping. I'm deliberately glossing the theatrical experiments of the 1960s and 70s because at this point, they may as well never have happened. Apparently, we have the composer Richard Wagner to thank for this oppressive, paternalistic version of the theater. In his vision for the ultimate operatic experience at his theater in Bayreuth, Germany, inaugurated in 1866, the spectator would experience operas directly, unencumbered by the reactions of others around them. This was achieved through architecture, sightlines, and space, through lighting and highly controlled darkness, and through the construction of a double proscenium, which made the stage appear further away from the audience than it actually was, reinforcing the distance and divide between the mythic, or as Wagner called them, the mystic stories on stage and the audience that assembled to view them. If Wagner had his way, he would have put up partitions between each seat so that the experience of the spectator would be individual and absolute, unimpeded by the reactions of others or the collective response of the crowd. Though Wagner took inspiration from Greek tragedy and what he put on the stage, it seems he missed the boat on what Athenian drama's relationship was to its audience. The principal experiment of Athenian drama during the 5th century BC hinged on the reciprocity between plays, both tragedies and comedies, and their audiences. That's what the word amphitheater in Greek means, reciprocity. Amphi, both sides, and theatron, the seeing place, the place where we see in both directions, where I see you and you see me, where the actors see the spectators, where the characters see the chorus, where the citizens in a democracy go to see and be seen and see themselves in the struggles reflected in ancient stories of the Bronze Age mythological past that may have never happened, but existed in the minds, the imaginations, and the civil and religious practices of 5th century Athenians, where Dionysus, the god of drama, wine, ecstasy, and the boundary disillusion, is worshipped through performances designed to break down the boundaries between the spectator and performer, audience and chorus, myth and reality. It is this element of theater in particular, its capacity to dissolve boundaries, which I refer to as an ancient technology. Greek tragedies are like external hard drives. Dust them off, plug them into the right audience, the play knows what to do, and the audience does too. In the early days of theater of war, I remember observing the stark contrast between how audiences behaved in the commercial and nonprofit theaters and how they behaved in non-theatrical spaces such as homeless shelters and community centers. While attending a performance at New York Theater Workshop of The Grand Inquisitor, a stage adaptation of a chapter from Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov, directed by Peter Brook, I watched an elderly man next to me nod off in the darkness during an admittedly boring moment, dropping his glasses to the floor as his consciousness briefly slipped away from him. From the reaction of the people around us, all educated white upper middle class theater goers who paid $75 a ticket to attend, who clucked and grunted and shook their heads vigorously with disapproval, shushing the already unconscious man, it was as if the elderly audience member in question had shouted a loud, deeply offensive obscenity at the stage during a moment of silence, when all he had done was drop his glasses. The man was asleep, and yet the audience members around him forcefully believed and asserted that they were awake, but I couldn't help wondering if they had it backwards because of an experience I'd had the week before at a homeless shelter in Queens. It happened during a performance of Theater of War at the Borden Avenue Veterans Residence in Long Island City, a transitional living facility for veterans experiencing homelessness. During the reading from Sophocles' Philologist, a play about a chronically ill veteran who is abandoned by the Greek army on the way to the Trojan War on account of his illness, while the actor performing the title role went for it, ripping through the text, howling in agony, consumed by a fit of spasms and pain, a group of 8 men in the front row, mostly African-American and Latino, mostly from the Vietnam era, started drifting off into the semi-consciousness of a methadone fog, slumped over in their chairs, their heads nodding up and down, their hands grazing the floor. I had presumed from my place of naive privilege that they weren't hearing a word of what was being said by the actors, that they were asleep and I was awake. But after the reading, when I stood up and turned out and asked the audience of veterans if the play had resonated with them, nearly 100 hands shot up, including the hands of 8 men in the front, and a man in the back wearing a brown 3-piece suit shouted out, "Hey, Bryan, you got a year? I got about 20 volumes in the back of my cubicle." And a conversation ensued in which the men of the Borden Avenue Veterans Residence demonstrated what it means to be conscious, making some of the most insightful connections to the play that I'd ever heard, shattering all my preconceptions of who is awake and who is asleep and what it means to listen. This observation is only deepened with experience and time as we've performed over the past 10 years for hundreds of thousands of people in non-theatrical settings and in spaces of our own devising in which we've been able to welcome audiences that we call our VIPs, gang affiliated, living in public housing, homeless, in recovery, attending Title I schools, formerly incarcerated, and welcome and invite them to be themselves without policing or assaulting them with instructions or condescending to their intelligence. We value our VIPs so much that we spend most of our budget on transportation and dinner for them, pizza but in New York, pizza is currency, and offer the best seats in the house closest to the performance. And so it has become predictable, almost rote, no longer surprising in any way, that it is inevitably always the young person from the underserved zip code with his phone out, listening audibly to music through one headphone throughout the event, his sneakers propped up on the seat in front of him, who has been laughing throughout the performance and what the acculturated audience members behind him consider inappropriate moments, who has never heard of Sophocles, who raises his hand during the discussion and explicates the play and what it signifies today in ways that no educated or privileged person ever could. And when this happens, every single night, it becomes crystal clear that cultural institutions, and even, yes, institutions of higher learning, are extensions of the very systems of oppression that we are trying to address with our work. Rather than being used to democratize discussion and communalize trauma, the theater, and by extension, culture and higher education, establishes a hierarchy of knowledge and value based on privilege and education, wealth, and power. The philologist, Friedrich Nietzsche writes in We Philologists, his wry polemic against 19th century classicism, must first of all be a man, or I would translate a fully realized human. Philology in Greek means the love of words, and for centuries the term has been used to describe the profession of studying ancient languages and cultures. Nietzsche argues, tongue firmly planted in his cheek, that, quote, old men are suited to be philologists if they were not such during the portion of their lives which was richest in experiences. In other words, only those of us who've lived the extremities of life, who've loved and traveled and risked and lost and suffered, can extract anything of value from reading the ancients. Conversely, he suggested, studying philology can get in the way of living a full, rich life. In short, he concludes with a playful jab at his critics, 99 philologists out of 100 should not be philologists at all. At the heart of Nietzsche's playful argument resides a different hierarchy of knowledge than one commonly encountered in cultural and academic institutions, one that positions experience as a prerequisite for understanding. And if one follows his logic to its natural conclusion, education itself can be seen, sometimes, as an impediment to knowledge and to the direct and efficacious experience of life. I have been told that the theme for this year at Kenyon College is learning, unlearning, and relearning. So it's in the spirit of this theme and of establishing a new hierarchy of knowledge that I'm asking you to entertain the possibility, borne out through the work I've been describing, that people with no education, who have never heard of the foundational texts that are studied at Kenyon, have more to teach us than we to teach them about these stories. The week that COVID-19 hit New York City, we were scheduled to bring our military project, Theater of War, to the Theater of War for the first time. A four-star general named Kenneth Mackenzie, the commander of CENTCOM, which presides over US military operations in the Middle East, who had first seen us perform for the Joint Chiefs of Staff in 2017, had decided months earlier that our troops in Kuwait and Qatar and Bahrain couldn't wait until they returned to the States to begin talking about combat trauma and suicide and moral injury. The moment was now if we were to get ahead of these issues, name them, and begin addressing them as a community before coming home. General Mackenzie had an urgent reason for bringing us to the Middle East. In December of 2018, Vice Admiral Scott Stearney, who commanded the Navy's Fifth Fleet in the Arabian Gulf, the Red Sea, the Gulf of Oman, and the Indian Ocean, had taken his own life while on duty at his residence in Bahrain. His death by suicide had shaken the command, reverberating all the way down to the chain, reinforcing the need to get people talking and seeking help before it was too late. Needless to say, we were excited. Our bags were packed. The New Yorker had assigned a staff writer, the Turkish-American Pulitzer Prize finalist Elif Batuman, to go with us to cover the tour, which would include 15 performances of Sophocles' Ajax on multiple bases, spread out through the AOR, or Area of Responsibility, for as many as 5,000 service members who had all been voluntold, as they say in the military, to attend mandatory performances of Greek tragedies classified as trainings. But on March 11, we received the news that the airport to which we were flying in Kuwait City had been shut down due to COVID restrictions. The tour was postponed, and in the weeks that followed, as the pandemic spread, it became increasingly clear that we wouldn't be returning to live performances for months, if not years to come. A week later, one of our actors, Jamani Williams, who also happened to be public advocate for New York City, sent me a series of late night texts. From the very beginning, Jimani, a community organizer and activist who previously served as city council member for the 45th District of New York, representing Flatbush and East Flatbush, Brooklyn, had been on the front lines of the pandemic. He was out raising alarms in the media and on the streets about healthcare inequality and the disproportionate impact the disease was already having on Black and brown communities that he served. The text he wrote me said, "Hey man, hope you and your staff and families are weathering okay. Any thoughts about trying to do a reading online? Apps like Zoom, free up to 100 folks, might be worth a try. If there's something we can do around the pandemic and isolation, I'd love to have the Public Advocate's Office officially co-sponsor a performance and conversation." I told him we'd give it some thought, and then about a week later, we got back to him with our pitch. I think we should do a reading of Sophocles' Oedipus the King, I wrote. It's about arrogant leaders, ignored prophecy, and a plague that sickens the city of Thebes. Without hesitating, we set a date, May 7th, to premiere the project on Zoom, and Jimani immediately signed on to co-host the performance through his office, as well as to play the chorus leader, who is the public advocate of Thebes. We rolled up our sleeves, and the Theater of War Productions company manager, Marjolaine Goldsmith, a former classics major and alumna of Oberlin College, just down the road from Gambier, set out to learn everything she could about how Zoom's webinar platform works and how it could be adapted and hacked and shaped and molded to reflect our core values. By merging the ancient technology of tragedy with the emerging technology of Zoom, our hope was to create a global amphitheater where actors and audience members could see in both directions. However, our aim was to do this without succumbing to the slightly gross and voyeuristic and even coercive elements of Zoom, where viewers are tempted to violate the privacy of other viewers by scrolling through windows into people's homes and lives. At Marjolaine's suggestion, we quickly resolved that the spectators would be view only until the discussion, when, by using the raise your hand function, much like tonight, they could assert their desire to end up on the screen in the community of people discussing the ancient play. But even so, if someone from the audience was going to end up on the screen, they would have to consent to it, not by raising their hand, but also by enabling their video and audio. Still, we knew from experience from our live performances that the possibility of ending up on the screen, however distant, would change the way people listen to the play and to each other. Finally, among many other smaller but still significant changes we made in the back end of this corporate communications tool, which we were repurposing to create a new broadcast medium, merging elements of live theater, film, television, and social media, we disabled the chat function because, as we all know, chat is the death of all good conversation. Chat and actors talking about their craft. Also, by eliminating chat, we were inviting all of the participants who wished to speak to take the risk of entering the dynamic live broadcast space in which both the actors and the audience members would take the risk of being present through extemporaneous performance and speech, and of being themselves, of making mistakes, and most critically, of not sounding brilliant. I should note here that the invitation to make mistakes and not sound brilliant stands at the center of our model. It's part of the risk proposition of the exchange. The actors take the risk of performing Greek tragedy on Zoom at full tilt with minimal rehearsal, and the audience in turn takes the risk of responding to the ancient play from their hearts and guts, speaking in the moment and off the cuff to what touched them across time. The ability to make mistakes and recover from them is how I would define professionalism. It's what the actors model for the audience in the performance, and the audience in turn does during the discussion. Making mistakes is what makes us human, as the Greek tragedies we perform always bear out, and acknowledging our mistakes and moving on from them is the only way out of this mess. Now, it didn't hurt that we were able to confirm Oscar Isaac to play Oedipus and Francis McDormand to play Jocasta, John Turturro to play Creon, and Jeffrey Wright to play Tiresias, alongside many other notable actors from film and television. May 7 was just early enough in the pandemic and the ensuing lockdown all over the world that the novelty of presenting Oedipus on Zoom attracted national media, as well as the attention of lots of stir-crazy people who were hungry, even desperate to connect in isolation. Finally, it didn't hurt that we already had a long and large following of loyal audience members who had attended our live events in New York City over the past 3 years, more than 20,000 people. An audience that, according to the recent surveys we given, is 70% of color, with 68% of people identifying as women, from some of the most underserved neighborhoods from all 5 boroughs. But in spite of everything that we had going for us, on our first performance of Oedipus on Zoom, nothing could have prepared me for what happened that night when more than 15,000 people from over 40 countries gathered in our digital amphitheater to participate in the Oedipus Project. Sophocles' Oedipus the King was first performed in the spring of 429 BC, a year after a plague ravaged Athens, killing nearly 1/3 of the population. The audience that gathered to watch the play did so during a lull in transmission between the first and second waves of the pestilence. And so it should come as no surprise that Oedipus the King deals with themes that appear as relevant now as they were 2,500 years ago. At the beginning of the play, a group of Theban citizens gather at the steps of the palace to appeal for help from Oedipus, who 16 years prior arrived in Thebes and saved the city from the bloodthirsty Sphinx by answering her riddle correctly. What walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs at noon, and 3 legs in the evening? Man, Oedipus replied, freeing the people of Thebes from the Sphinx forever. And as a reward, he was made king of Thebes and married their queen, Jocasta. Fast forward 18 years to where the play begins. The city of Thebes is under attack yet again, and this time by a plague that has been killing its people, its livestock, and its crops. A priest steps forward from the crowd and addresses the king. Look, and you will see a storm-battered city drowning in an ocean of blood, no longer able to lift her head above the cresting waves. A savage pestilence has ravaged the land, killing the cattle and the crops. Our women die in labor, delivering shriveled little corpses as the hateful plague spreads like a raging wildfire, devouring the city without mercy, emptying homes and filling the streets with moans and wailing and heaps of rotting bodies, while death-rich Hades makes off with the shades. And a moment later, the chorus of Theban citizens, played by Jumaane Williams, rises to make their case. The people of Thebes are sick and cannot find the words to cure the disease, nor scalpel, nor sword that will halt its progression. The crops wither, fields grow fallow, our women cry out, straining under the relentless pain of labor, but never give birth. The people are dying. You can see them dropping here and there faster than a ravenous fire, plummeting like wide-winged birds from the sky to distant shores of Hades, land of gloom and shadows. Immeasurable death overwhelms the city. The corpses of children lie rotting in the streets unburied, with no one left to mourn them or tend to their bodies, while white-haired widows and young mothers gather round altars, groaning and wailing and begging for an end to the endless suffering. The chorus soon learns from Jocasta's brother, Creon, whom Oedipus has just sent to consult the oracle at Delphi, that until the man or men who murdered his predecessor, King Laius, are apprehended, neither exiled or executed, the plague will never abate. And so, wasting no time, Oedipus launches an investigation, promising to bring the criminal to justice, and summons the blind seer Tiresias to help him solve the mystery. When Tiresias arrives, tapping his cane, guided by a boy to the palace steps, and takes in the scene before him, he says the following lines. Ah, how terrible it is to know, when in the end, knowing gains you nothing. I knew this once, but must have somehow forgotten, or else I never would have come. Oedipus interrogates the seer, pressing him to reveal what he knows, eventually becoming impatient and rageful and paranoid, consumed by conspiracy theories. And then he sets out to undermine both Creon and Tiresias for not telling him what he wants to hear, ultimately accusing them of attempting to steal his power and expel him from office. Wealth, power, unsurpassed skill, these are the things that men like you always envy, harboring hatred for those who wear the crown. I did not ask for it. It was given to me freely by the people of Thebes as a gift. And now Creon, my loyal friend from the very beginning, has hatched a secret plan to expel me from office, all the while desiring it for himself. He is the one who sent this snake oil salesman, this so-called expert, this psychic and assassin in beggar's clothes who can see plainly enough when it comes to making profit, but is bankrupt and blind when it comes to his craft. Tell me, Tiresias, if you are truly a prophet, where were you when the savage Sphinx was attacking these people? Why didn't you simply answer her riddle and liberate the city from her terror if you are so wise? Why were you so quiet? The riddle required real vision and insight, and in your silence, you were shown to be lacking in both. It's all a scam. You know nothing about interpreting birds, let alone the will of the gods. It was I, Oedipus, who supposedly knows nothing, who arrived here and immediately stopped the Sphinx using reason and wit to answer her riddle. I had no help from your feathered friends, and now you wish to throw me from the throne, hoping to stand closest to Creon when he wears the crown. You and your co-conspirator, I think, will soon lament the day you concocted the plot to drive the so-called pollution from this land. And if you weren't such a silly, senile old man, you would have already learned the danger of your behavior by suffering gravely on account of it, to which Tiresias responds with the unadulterated truth. You are an enemy to your own above and below the earth, but you don't know it. The dreadful double-edged curse of your mother and father will one day send you stumbling from this land. You may see the light now, but you will soon be pitched into utter darkness. And on that day, the day when you finally discover the truth about your marriage, that profane harbor into which you once sailed on strong, steady winds, your shrieking and bellowing will be heard throughout the world, echoing and reverberating over the peaks of Mount Kithaeron. There are even worse horrors on the horizon for you and your family, unimaginable evils that will wipe out your entire line, destroying you along with your children. So feel free to continue slandering me and Creon for all the things I have said. You will be ground down to powder, and no man will suffer as savagely as you. Which turns out to be what happens. Several scenes later, when the truth finally begins to dawn upon him, Oedipus discovers that he is the source of the infection, the contagion that is plaguing the land. I am tainted, polluted, profaned, I am filthy, I am a virus, a deadly infection spreading. And later, when he discovers the full truth of his identity, fulfilling the prophecy from which he tried to escape as a young man, that he killed his own father and unwittingly married his own mother, Oedipus sees that he was blind to the truth and what was always right in front of him all along. And after learning that Jocasta, his mother and wife, has taken her own life by hanging herself from a twisted noose, overwhelmed and unable to face the truth, Oedipus takes Jocasta's hairpins and gouges out his eyes, plunging himself into permanent darkness, shouting, "Never again will you see the horrors I must suffer or the evil I have done. I condemn you to darkness, for you saw things that you should not have seen, and you failed to see what was right in front of you all this time." An especially gruesome gesture, which on the night of the premiere reflected the sheer commitment of the actor Oscar Isaac, who blacked out his eyes with charcoal paint and delivered Oedipus's final lines from memory, so that in the shadows of his living room where he was performing, for a fleeting moment amidst the howls and moans, it looked as if he had really gouged out his eyes. The note that I always give actors before they go on stage is this: make them wish they'd never come. Not through boredom, ennui, or for underplaying the material, but through sheer commitment, by pushing past what can be consumed to a place of such horror and discomfort that every spectator wishes to avert their eyes, but simultaneously cannot look away. In the early days, I thought our work was about eliciting empathy, and that's certainly a byproduct of the experience, but the real tool of our trade is shared discomfort. If we can make the entire audience really, really uncomfortable, an opening occurs, no matter what divides us, racially, socially, politically, geographically, then at least we can all acknowledge we are uncomfortable. And then we can interrogate as a community what it makes us all so uncomfortable. In large part, that is what the discussions that emerge from our performances are about. In the lead up to the first performance of the Oedipus Project, I'd been skeptical about what we'd be able to achieve on Zoom, not even a fraction, I imagined, of the intimacy and power afforded by our live performances in physical spaces. But Zoom, it turns out, is nothing short of a miracle, a paradigm-shifting human innovation, which came at the precise moment we needed it, which can achieve in ways that we are only now just beginning to understand a level of intimacy and power that I never thought possible. People speak of Zoom fatigue, but it's just a technology like Greek tragedy, which I'm sure, as you all know, can be even deadlier than Zoom when approached without spirit or imagination. During a discussion that unfolded from our first performance on Zoom, a remarkable group of people, mostly women of color from Brooklyn, Queens, and the Bronx, appeared on the screen to offer their insights into the play and into the pandemic. As each person enabled her video and audio, we were given a window into the countless backyards, bathrooms, kitchens, living rooms, and closets, which, when combined with the phenomenon of people looking directly into their cameras as if speaking quietly over coffee or drinks to a friend, generated a sense of connection so strong that when refracted back through the performance, it seemed to transcend the boundaries of space and time. The overwhelming theme that emerged was hope. Hope that we can, as a society, stop looking to individuals to save us and look for salvation in the pluralistic collective and in the dismantling of systems of oppression. Hope that Oedipus learned from his mistakes and truly gained sight in his blindness, and that our leaders will someday see how blind they really are. Hope that the pandemic will help white America finally wake up and see the systemic oppression and inequity we've intentionally blinded ourselves to before it's too late. One audience member who gave me hope that night was a paramedic lieutenant from the FDNY named Anthony Almohera. The play, where do you start, he said. There are so many parallels, not only to the federal government, but to our own mad king, but also to the players all the way down. One of the things that jumped out to me as a 9/11 provider was when Oedipus was moaning and wailing. It made me think about the patients in their final moments and the ambulance sirens. The wailing of the ambulance sirens going through the streets. This is what people hear in the pandemic, you know? The average person just hears the sirens and they know where it's going to. It's taken over the din of the city. The doctors are seeing their patients in the hospital, but I'm going into their homes and seeing pictures and paintings and all the characters that make up their lives. And then I'm seeing them as their life is leaving them. And it's this thing. This thing is a blessing to bear witness to sometimes, just to be there. If nothing else, if I can't save them, at least I'm there to bear witness. I appear as an apparition. You know, I'm covered in a mask and all they see is the eyes. Everything else is covered. And it's this white on white on white. And it almost looks like a ghost. And I'm there to bear witness as a ghost. And it takes away the humanity of it. And I have to keep a distance from these people. And that weighs heavily on the people in EMS, because when we can't save you, we are there to comfort the living and your families. But because everybody's a potential patient, I have to keep them at a distance. I don't want to think of Oedipus as a sympathetic character, but he is. Unlike our leaders now, some of them don't elicit sympathy. But all the patients who are suffering, what we're seeing in the streets today, they do. And I'll just close with this. The ending of the play offers hope. And if there's one thing that keeps EMS people going and the doctors and everybody else going, it's that you have to have a little reservoir of hope. Unfortunately, we've lost 4 members to COVID, and I had a young man commit suicide recently. He was 23, and he worked out in the Bronx and was new, and he came out of the academy in the pandemic, and he couldn't handle what he was seeing, and that could rob us all of our hope. And if there's one emotion that makes humanity human, to be humane to each other, it's hope. And the play ends with just a little hope. That's how I interpret it, and that's my message to everyone here tonight. Often people who know me ask, where's the hope in all this tragedy you perform? Hope, I tell them, is not in the ancient play, but in the community that assembles to bear witness to its truth. In the weeks and months that followed our first performance on Zoom, Theater of War Productions has presented more than a dozen performances online, projects based on Shakespeare's King Lear, the biblical book of Job, Sophocles' Philoctetes, Women of Trachis, and Antigone, for an ever-expanding international audience representing more than 68 countries and more than 50,000 people so far. After the death of George Floyd, and in the light of the protests that have erupted across the country and the world, fueled by the killings of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Tony McDade, Deion Johnson, and so many others, we decided to present our project on racialized violence and social justice, which is called Antigone and Ferguson, on Zoom in early August, on the 6th anniversary of the death of Michael Brown Jr., featuring performances by Tracy Toms, Oscar Isaac, and a community-based gospel choir that, by design, could not preach to itself. Antigone and Ferguson fuses readings by acclaimed actors of Sophocles Antigone with live choral music performed by a diverse choir, including Black Lives Matter activists, youth, teachers, 2 of Michael Brown's teachers from Normandy High School, police officers who responded to the uprising in Ferguson, and concerned citizens from St. Louis, Missouri, and New York City, culminating in powerful, constructive, healing discussions. The project was conceived in the wake of Michael Brown Jr.'s death in 2014 through a collaboration between Theater of War Productions and community members from Ferguson, Missouri, and it premiered at Normandy High School, Michael Brown's alma mater, in September of 2016. Since then, the project has toured the country and the world, culminating in a 10-week run in Brooklyn last year. Sophocles Antigone is an age-old story about a sister who puts everything on the line to bury her brother's body when it has been forbidden by law. The play explores what happens when the law of the state clashes violently with the law of family, the law of love and personal conviction. At the core of the play is a question: when everyone is right or feels justified in what they're doing and someone is likely going to die, how do we avert the violence that will inevitably take place? It is a question that we are now facing as a nation, which Sophocles' ancient play is uniquely positioned to help us collectively explore. We are tonight, at this very moment, in Louisville, Kentucky, in Brooklyn, New York, in Kenosha, Wisconsin, in Portland, Oregon, and in Rochester, New York, to name only a few places around the country where this is true. As Tiresias says in the play, we are standing on the razor's edge. We premiered Antigone and Ferguson on Zoom on August 9th as the official culminating event in the Michael Brown Jr. Memorial Weekend, and decided to center the discussion on the perspectives of people who had lost children and family members to racialized police violence. One of the first family members to speak during the discussion was Gwen Carr, the mother of Eric Garner, one of the leaders of the mothers of the movement. And she said, "What resonated with me most was Antigone. She was such a steadfast person. And no matter what they planned to do to her, no matter what that king said he was going to do, that he would have her killed, she stood fast to her conviction." And I think that was amazing, because this is what we need to do today. No matter what they say, no matter how they say we're going to be punished, if we think something is right, this is something we should stand for, because sometimes we have to step out of the box. We can't always stay in our safety zone. We can't always be comfortable with our decisions. I know in my case, after they murdered my son, I said, what else could they take? I'm going to stand. I'm going to be an activist. I'm going to stand up no matter what happens. And this is what I did. And that's why now I travel the world and I try to make it easier for other people, because if one person backs down and then the next person backs down, we are never going to move in the right direction. So I say somebody's got to take a stand. We know somebody is going to die for the decisions that some of us make. And we may be the sacrificial lamb so others can live and others can be justified. Miss Carr was joined on screen by a chorus of mothers and family members, including Valerie Bell, Sean Bell's mother, Uncle Bobby X, Oscar Grant's uncle, and Marion Gray Hopkins, another one of the mothers of the movement whose son, Gary Hopkins Jr., was murdered by police in Prince George County, Maryland on November 27th, 1999. Antigone was very much like us, Marion said. I mean, the mothers of the movement, we're all standing strong and we're not backing down. I want people to know that we're standing up for those who can't stand for themselves. We are standing for our loved ones along with theirs, and we're not giving up. We're going to stand in this, and we're going to challenge the status quo. I often say that the status quo is the enemy. If you don't do anything about what's going on, then you are part of the problem. So we are continuing to talk to people because someone is hearing our voice. Someone is going to do what is necessary to make required change so that we will not continue to see our loved ones murdered. Creon said something that really resonated with me tonight. He said, "There's blood on my hands," when his wife and his son were murdered. And I say that those who allow the deaths of our loved ones to continue senselessly have the blood of our children on their hands as well. About a month after the premiere of Antigone and Ferguson on Zoom, on September 3rd, we presented our third performance of the Oedipus Project online, this time starring a cast of UK-based actors, including Damian Lewis, Jason Isaacs, Catherine Hunter, Leslie Sharp, and several others. The audience that turned out and tuned in spanned 48 countries, and it was reflected in the true pluralistic diversity seen on the screen. Early in the conversation, a woman who works on the custodial staff from a janitor's closet at the hospital where she worked spoke about the connection she saw between the play and the present moment. Hi, my name is Modija, but everyone calls me Mo. It's a little easier. I work in a hospital as part of the housekeeping department. We see things from the back end. We see both the way the patient reacts to the things, and we see the way the staff reacts to certain things. Patients sort of talk to us more. They voice how they really feel about the staff, and vice versa. We see both. The part in the beginning where we hear the chorus coming to Oedipus about how they want to fix everything, it's kind of like the doctors. The patients are dying and they're sick and they don't know what's going on. And the doctors don't really know how the virus works. And they're trying to figure it out too. But you're looking at a doctor as a savior, someone who's going to fix you and make you better. But they don't know how to fix you because they're learning about the virus at the same time as you're having it. They're learning through trial and error. And then there were the bodies piling up on top of bodies. We've actually seen that here. The morgue has been overcrowded. We had trucks come and take bodies out because people were dying left and right. People are still dying. We can't send our kids back to school if the problem's still there. So we need to figure out a way to fix this. We have Democrats and Republicans going back and forth, fighting over a debate about who's going to be elected. Right now, that's not the problem. Human life is the problem. We're trying to save each other. People don't understand that. They don't want to see it. The pandemic is here, and we also have the whole Black Lives Matter movement going right through now because of the injustice with the police and people of color. And that's already been a problem. It's not a new problem. It's a very old problem. And you guys are arguing about things that are irrelevant. After an early performance of Theater of War, a female general stood up and she took on my question. Why do you think Sophocles wrote this play? It's a question I've asked countless audiences. And she said, I think Sophocles wrote these plays to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. And that's what happens every time we perform Greek tragedies for audiences who have lived lives of mythological proportions, audiences with something at stake. We are comforted by what brings us together across disparate human experiences, comforted that we can have a common reaction to an uncomfortable portrayal of human suffering, and afflicted by the reality that watching a play and having a discussion is not enough. It's just the beginning. And afflicted by the reality that there's so much more that we can be doing to mitigate the suffering of people who may be sitting to our left and our right, in our homes, on public transportation, and in our places of work and of worship, and in isolation during the pandemic with the screams of characters from ancient Greek tragedies in their heads, though we can't hear them. And so it's with this sense of affliction that I'm going to conclude my remarks, with the hope that it will lead not just to powerful and dynamic discussion, but to consciousness and to positive action. Thank you very much. So obviously, if we were in a live space at this point, hopefully there would be a little applause, but it would also be an exchange between us and a moment where we would acknowledge that we'd all had this live experience together. We'd like to transition now in the time that we have left to having a discussion, especially in the lead up to the presidential debate tonight. And so if you have a question and you want to engage about any of the themes that you heard raised by me tonight on behalf of Theater of War Productions as we launch this year-long virtual residency at Kenyon College, all you have to do is use the raise your hand function on Zoom. And once you raise your hand, my colleague Marjolaine Goldsmith will immediately escort you to the screen or onto the virtual stage where we can have a conversation, a dialogue. And usually we look out into every audience to see who's going to engage. And often, without question, there's always one extremely kind person. I know you're out there. Usually the most intelligent and attractive person in the virtual room who puts us all out of the long and awkward misery of an interminable silence until we'll wait until that incredibly kind, intelligent, no doubt attractive and wonderful person raises their hand to join us in conversation about some of the themes that were raised tonight in my talk. Typically, we have the advantage of an enormous audience. We have one person coming on now, so I know there's not safety in numbers in this instance because we're relatively intimate, but Michelle, thank you for joining us. I really look forward to your question. And as people join us and engage, we'll leave them on the screen so we can actually stay in community and discussion as we sift through some of these ideas. Michelle.
Right, so thank you for a very mind-blowing presentation and discussion. It gave me chills.
Thanks.
So I was curious if I wanted to focus on kind of a pragmatic question, was this idea about knowledge not being held by the experts is one I also consider in even something pragmatic like the development, politics of development, and this idea that we have a high modernist vision, we are the experts. So I would love to change this. I wonder if you do this enough to faculty and academics, if we can puncture that a little bit, because unless they see what you're talking about, the incredible wisdom of, the common masses, we're not going to move the needle. And so, yeah, and I'm worried that the ones who need to hear it aren't here, aren't listening. I may be a pessimist, but that was kind of my pragmatic question about changing that hierarchy of wisdom.
Yeah, so I mean, in the context of what we're about to do with Kenyon, I should say our first performance, Antigone and Ferguson, will be for the Ohio 5, but with a focus on really engaging people on October 8th who are closest in proximity to the issues that we're trying to address and focus on the community. But the next performance in the residency will be for Knox County. And it will be a reading of the book of Job from the Old Testament, the Hebrew poem. And our contention is that the book of Job is, an ecumenical text, a text that everyone has a valid, opportunity to interpret. And so we'll engage Nazarene, we'll engage churches and synagogues and faith institutions in Mount Vernon. I'd like to engage the Amish community, although I'm not sure they would want to use this technology. But needless to say, the next performance will be taking the circle wider. And then with the collaboration of the Kenyon community, staff, faculty, community members, I mean, some of my most memorable and powerful experiences as a young person attending Kenyon were actually interactions I have with the food service staff in the dining halls when I was first there. How far can we reach, not just in the Kenyon community, but also outside of it, to devise a project together that goes deep into an issue that concerns the community at large? And then with our last performance, can we take the experience wider, and can we engage an international potential community beyond even the alumni body? And through all of that, we'll be experimenting with ideas of how do we center the conversation on those who stand in proximity to the issues we're trying to address. So for instance, for the book of Job, we recently did a performance where the primary audience were people who'd just been released from incarceration. And they responded first on Zoom in a transitional living facility called Exodus. And then because of the technology of Zoom, we could then pivot and bring them into dialogue with people, 4,000 people throughout the world, who may never have listened or heard to the perspectives of people who'd just been released from jails or prisons. And by situating the discussion and centering it on individuals who'd experienced incarceration, we then framed the conversation about the sort of system of justice we see portrayed in the book of Job. which I'm sure we'll get to talk about as a community. So there are all kinds of ways that we try to do this. They're not always successful in academia. Really recently, we were integrated into the core curriculum at Columbia University, where we made the stipulation that if we were going to perform at Columbia for the first year students, we had to have the budget to bring veterans who were experiencing homelessness to the performance and welcome them into the space and engage them as part of the discussion. And it was successful on a lot of levels that we were able to do that. The dean who brought us there was terrific. There was an incredible exchange between a 72-year-old African-American veteran who recounted his own response to the play Philologist in really powerful ways. And then an 18-year-old behind him stood up and said, it had never occurred to me that these plays actually mean something. And then the 72-year-old veteran turned back to the young man and said, thank you for saying that. It's really refreshing to hear a young person's perspective. And I feel like that's what we're after, the possibility of respecting all the types of intelligence and sensitivities that are in every room. And that's why audience curation is the key to the answer to your question. If we've done due diligence on making sure that the audience actually reflects the communities we're trying to address that are in proximity to the issues we're trying to talk about, then the audience will be the master in the end. So anyway, that's a quick answer. But stay on the screen, Michelle, because you may have a thought later. And again, this is just an exercise in thinking out loud together for the fleeting 30 minutes we have together before Joe Biden and Donald Trump start to eviscerate each other on national media. Gabriella, I believe you're next.
Oh, thank you. Well, I'm not involved in the U.S. Theater scene. I'm from Peru, actually. But since this pandemic started, I was really interested on doing some kind of theater project regarding classics, from Peruvian classics, Peruvian classics to Greeks. And then I read the New Yorker article and I discovered you guys. And it was like, what the hell? I need to see more about what you guys are doing, because I wanted to do something with plays that exist already, because the problems are repeating over and over and over. They just keep repeating, right? So I have a couple of questions. One is that you're exporting, I think, this experience to I think England. So I wanted to ask you about how you guys are doing that, what are you doing when you are trying to reach other realities, other theater scenes? That's number one. And maybe two would be what's the rehearsal time? How do you guys work? It's extremely difficult to direct actors via Zoom. It's hell. I hate it. So that's how you guys do it. And
so to answer the second question first, which is the easiest, is simply say we barely rehearse at all. And that's because we respect the actors as much as we respect the audience. And that's to say we work with actors that are from my perspective, the equivalent of, Thelonious Monk, John Coltrane, and Miles Davis, who can riff and improvise in ways that if we over-rehearsed, A, would seem too polished for the exchange, which is also about messing up and recovering. And B, I leave spaces in my translations of the plays for the actors to interpolate, which is what Shakespeare did too. Not to compare myself to Shakespeare, but Shakespeare didn't preside over the publication of his folios of his plays because they were always changing, and because actors played a role in the authoring of the plays. And I feel the same way, not just about actors, but also about audiences. Audiences are constantly authoring our plays and translating them as well. So there's this direct reciprocity between choices actors make and what happens in the audience and what they say, and then how we shape the text and the way we perform the next time. And so we have a company of over 200 actors who, when they get the call, they jump to do this work, primarily also just to hear from the audience the real direction, which is coming from people who've lived the experiences. So in the old days, we would fly into a community, stay in a Holiday Inn, which is a cheap hotel in the United States, and rehearse at 10 at night, and usually get security called on us because the actors are screaming. And then And then if we didn't get security called on us, it wasn't a successful rehearsal. And then the next morning go perform like 4 back-to-back performances of ancient Greek plays for 1,000 soldiers, a performance on a military base. And I say to the actors, the dress rehearsal is the performance. And when you hear a person, a soldier or a spouse come up and say, that line that you said, I remember a veteran coming up to us after an early performance of Philoctetes, a play about a veteran who lives for 9 years like an animal in a cave because he's been abandoned by his own men and his own people. And this, after we performed it, this young man came up to David Strathairn, the actor who just done it, and me, and he said, without even any context, he just said, I just want to repeat a line that really touched me. So you see, I have everything I need here in this cave. And there was no way for David to ever say that line again the way he'd said it before, because it was imbued with such meaning and consciousness by the audience. So that's number one. The UK, I could go on for hours about. It's as if the UK is going back in time. The United States, for better and for worse, passed through the crucible of the Vietnam War. And we went through this moment where we criminalized our military. And we treated veterans, even those who were drafted into the military, as if they deserved to be punished for having carried out American foreign policy in Southeast Asia. And in so doing, we actually re-traumatized them and punished them and contributed to their suffering in ways that I think we've finally grown up from as a country, having passed through it. And so there are people on the left and the right who may not agree on very much, but I think primarily, as we've seen, because we perform in what's called Red State America all the time, in the United States, we all collectively agree that we should be talking about mental health and that we should be talking about it with sensitivity for this incredible struggle that mental health, the anguish of mental health issues actually presents to Americans, and the opioid crisis and everything else, poverty. And so when we go to the UK, it's an abject lesson in what it was like to be in the America in the 30s or 40s, where the principal treatment for trauma was actually a frontal lobotomy, like having your faculty of speech taken from you. That a culture that had sort of officially made medical the capacity to silence victims. And that's what Greek tragedies in the New Yorker article speaks to that to some extent, are so powerful because they name trauma. They speak the unspeakable. And once it's spoken, it can't be denied any longer. And so sometimes when we go to the UK, we perform with actors, and even the actors have this kind of ginger attitude about, well, we shouldn't talk too much about it. We don't want to create a culture of trauma or victims, where that's just a sort of byproduct, I think, of a culture that is victim blaming, that is silencing still, that is still re-traumatizing those who've been traumatized. And I feel like we as a country are waking up. I mean, we're waking up on so many fronts. I don't know if we're going to wake up in time, but it seems that we are waking up to the fact that it is not productive to re-traumatize people because they are struggling. And so when we performed in the UK before, we did it physically, and everyone said, it'll never work. The Brits will never speak, or the people in the UK. And of course they did. The only complaint they had was we didn't give them enough time. And when we went to Japan, we performed for the survivors of the Fukushima disaster, for an audience of mothers who'd all relocated their children from Fukushima to Tokyo because of the radiation. And we performed a Japanese no play from the 14th or 15th century called the Sumirigawa. And everyone told us the Japanese women would never speak and they would never emote, and it's not part of their culture. And if they did, it would be in accordance with a hierarchy where the most powerful woman would speak first. And of course, everything was out the window as soon as we performed, and expletives were flying and tears were being shed. And the only complaint the women in Tokyo had was we only gave them 2 hours to have the conversation. And it seemed that at that point, short of an alien invasion, I mean, we performed for Eastern Bloc countries where the same thing happened, short of an alien invasion from out of space, that we wouldn't find a culture that couldn't engage with this model in some way. This was somehow actually tapping into something very hardwired about what it means to be human. And so the UK sometimes is like, hard nut to crack, but as soon as we get in, whether it's by Zoom which we've been doing. We're doing another performance on Zoom for the UK in early November, or physically. Once we get in the room, and once people see their own struggles reflected in an ancient story, they open up just like any other audience in any other space. And I imagine in Peru, it would be the same. Alexia, thank you for waiting.
Hi, yes, I really enjoyed your talk. I had the privilege of attending a theater of war play when I lived in Ashland, Oregon.
Oh, wow.
There was one, yeah, there was one that was staged at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival.
Yes, I remember all too well.
Yes, and you chose to play Ajax, and it was very powerful. There were multiple veterans in the audience who discussed their experience of guilt and shame cultures within the military and struggles with suicide. And it was deeply moving. And as a Shakespeare person, it has inspired me to want to study trauma in Shakespeare and how similar things can be done with Shakespeare. But it seems as though Greek plays and Roman plays are not the only plays that you focus on. So how do you choose the plays that you focus on, and for what areas? How are you choosing where to go and what to speak to those areas?
Well, I mean, to be honest, we worked from hometown advantage. In the early days, it was just like, let me reach back to the shelf and find the text I studied at Kenyon during my first year that applies to this issue. Prometheus Bound, Sophocles Ajax, the Book of Job. These are all things that, you know, I encountered at Kenyon, and you know, they are works of Western literature. It's been really exciting over the last few years to be pushed outside of our hometown advantage of Western culture. In the early days, and in my book, I call myself an evangelist for classical Greek tragedy, but I no longer say that. I don't actually evangelize Greek tragedy in terms of the stories or the myths. I evangelize the structure of this technology that I think was built to communalize trauma, which can be applied to the myths and stories of any culture. The format, the structure of the amphitheater, of seeing in both directions, of coming together. And many other cultures have discovered it. And Japanese no plays in their medieval context were for a warrior class and for a priestly class that went to the theater to engage with stories about things like survivor's guilt or ghosts of people that you'd killed coming back to haunt you. We did a play, another no play, from the 15th century for veterans here in the United States after we'd gone to Japan and seen a play about a Genji warrior who on his first day in office is visited by the ghost of the young man, the civilian he killed. And then his mother appears and demands that he admit that he has committed a sort of sin or, you know, a wrong, and pray for the release of her son's spirit back into reincarnation. There wasn't a veteran who missed the significance of what that was about. There are many other cultures that have experienced this, that have created. I think if you give a culture long enough, that, you know, Tibetans developed their own spiritual technologies, the Greek developed theirs. These are these tools that we have lost touch with because they become commodified in late capitalism to be something that can be consumed. Shakespeare certainly was playing with some of the same tools and power. And so one of the Shakespearean plays we've been doing, and we'll be doing this month in October coming up, is King Lear, which we've been performing around the question of dementia and elder care and family dynamics for people who are aging. And we're going to be performing on October 14th at 1 p.m., at noon, excuse me, for free. I mean, it's open to the public. All our work is free, but centered at the largest, or until recently, the largest nursing home in North America that was hit very hard by COVID. And we'll have both staff and patients be part of the discussion as it pertains to King Lear. We started doing King Lear in housing projects in Brooklyn and in the Bronx. And to be clear, our mission is not cultural. I really don't care if people are interested in Shakespeare after we perform. I mean, that's nice. I'm much more interested in what these plays can catalyze in the community, how they can be of service. But after a performance in Brooklyn, one of the earliest ones for a senior center, we asked some of the Latino people in the room, and there was actually a German-speaking woman in the room who didn't know much English, if they understood what was being said in the play. And the answer from that woman was every word. And I learned that in Japan when we started directing no plays in Japanese, readings of them, that I knew what every word was too, if the actors committed to the truth behind every word. And this is really exciting, that we can realize that theater isn't actually text, even though text becomes a blueprint for a felt emotional experience. So right now, and this is a challenge to Kenyon, I'm going to be perfectly frank, we're at a sort of inflection point. We love the Greeks. Obviously, we have several projects in development. Oedipus the Colonus is our next one that we're going to be rolling out in the spring around elder care and homelessness. But we're also up against a wall with a lot of partners who say to us, hey man, you know, like, we're descendants of people from Africa. Why are you doing Greek plays? Like, you know, what? And so the answer is, we are assiduously and diligently digging into epic sources of Africa and other cultures to try to develop new plays. And I hope that 10, 15 years from now, the stage of development we were in, where we did lots of Greek plays, will be a footnote to where we'll be. And I'm hoping Kenyon can help us in that process. Yang, I think you're next, I believe. Once you unmute yourself.
Great. Thank you so much for the talk. Also, thank you for doing the 1-year visual residency at Kenyon. I'm actually teaching a course. It's a special topic course. It's called Simone Weil. We just actually read Simone Weil's famous essay, Ilia, or Poem of Force.
I just reread that last week.
We just read it this week. So I actually asked the students a question, kind of like a joke.
Yeah.
I asked, what do the following 3 people have in common? Simone Weil, Bryan Doerries, and Shaw. Well, the answer is this one word, Antigone.
Yeah.
Simone Weil also wrote an essay on Antigone.
Yeah.
That's very interesting. You are going to do Antigone in Ferguson.
Yeah.
I wrote a play called Antigone. It's in Chinese.
Fantastic.
It's also called Antigone because I was there in 1989 at the Tiananmen Square. So I rewrote the play. Yeah, I was very young and fearless, so I did that.
That's the right time. Yeah.
So I actually do not think that the Greeks are Western. They are actually very much like Eastern. I think that the divide is more the ancient versus the modern.
Yes.
The ancient cultures are all very similar.
Yeah.
We actually talk about the Exile Age civilizations. What's great about Simone Weil is that she actually draws upon the Indian culture, the Chinese culture, Buddhism. We're actually talking about those sources in her. I think you are catching up with her in that regard. And so I'm very happy to hear that.
We need a little more time.
You are also expanding your resources. Yeah. So maybe I will just ask one more specific question. I think it's a universal theme in all the ancient exile civilizations, which is how to make sense of suffering, calamities. And they also have this almost, I think this is another universal theme, which is they want to make sense of it in terms of a curse. Something that has done by someone in the past. And that's the cause of the calamity we are suffering now.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's extremely difficult to make sense of that idea today. That's actually one of the things I try to do in many of my courses. So when I teach climate change, I also want to bring up that topic, how to make sense of that.
Yeah.
That fact. So I'm really interested in how your audience responded to the play that you've done recently, especially Oedipus the King, because you intentionally put that in the context of the pandemic, because there is one danger, which is to single out some groups, right, as the scapegoat, so to speak.
Yes.
To make sense of the calamity.
Yes, in fact, we had a woman on the panel, the first performance, who represented a sort of federation of Asian American activists who were at that very moment fighting against the tropes of the Chinese disease and the virus. And we purposely put her on the screen alongside activists on the streets of Brooklyn, alongside people who represent incarcerated people, to really, to democratize a conversation about what it means to be on the front lines of these issues. Oedipus the King started off as our climate change project, and we actually had it queued up to be our climate change project before the pandemic. And we'd actually reached out to Greta Thunberg to play either the priest or Tiresias. And we wanted to have a chorus of young people as the Thebans, children, to raise that question about intergenerational curses and the inability of human beings from any generation, our own or previous, to plan for the next or the 5 generations from the one in which we inhabit. There are so many other themes, like ignored prophecy. I mean, I just tried to get Anthony Fauci to play Tiresias in our next performance. I mean, I honestly just wrote to him through the connections of the NIH, and they told me he was too busy. Should he get fired, I promise you, he was a classics major, it turns out. And he also cut his teeth in Brooklyn Hospital, where we'll be performing very soon. I really hope he will end up playing Tiresias, because this notion of what Tiresias says when he comes onto the screen, how terrible it is to know when in the end knowing gains you nothing, is something that I would like to hear Anthony Fauci or Greta Thunberg or many others who are the prophets of this time say, because I think it'll resonate with a lot of people.
Or maybe find James Hansen to play.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the good news is we have so many casting. So since Antigone and Ferguson, which was our first community collaboration, we started to bring the audience into the plays. And so as you'll see, when you join us on October 8th, we'll have 2 of Michael Brown's teachers alongside police officers from Ferguson, alongside actors that are well known, alongside young people. And that model is that model of community collaboration, having Jamani Williams, a public advocate, play the chorus leader, that's become our sort of model of working since about 2016. We just completed a project called The Suppliants, where we took Aeschylus's suppliant women, about 50 women seeking asylum at a border in ancient Argos from domestic violence and forced marriage to their cousins. And we had Garifuna women from Central America who are Afro-Caribbean culture, that indigenous culture that really is universally othered everywhere they've lived in their diaspora, and the largest portion sort of population of them are in the Bronx. And we had them imbue Aeschylus's play with their faith traditions, their atavism, their dege, which is a sort of form of voodoo, and created a series of songs that ran parallel to Aeschylus's play and spoke to it at moments, but also told their own story of exile. I think your point about ancient cultures is 100% correct. Also, cultures of diaspora and exile also make art and music that sounds very similar, we're learning. So we just did a version of The Suppliants with our partners in Amsterdam, actually last week, with an outdoor performance. Unfortunately, we couldn't go, where the chorus was all Kurdish women. And there were a lot of connections between the music of the Garifuna and what they expressed as they took ownership of this play, The Suppliants, and the Kurdish women. I want to transition to another person, but I just want to say that this idea about intergenerational curses is what people in communities of color and in communities of trauma really want to talk about. We performed my translation of Oedipus the first time in Eastern Correctional Facility, which is a supermax prison in New York State, where actually I taught a course in the Barred Prison Initiative on Greek tragedy with 27 inmates who were all doing 25 years to life. And I was teaching at Princeton within the year of that. And there's no question these are the best students I've ever had. And because I've never ever been listened to in the way they listened, they were so hungry for this exchange, and many of them would never get out of prison because of mandatory minimum sentences. And when we performed Oedipus for them in their theater in the prison, the dominant theme that people wanted to talk about,
interesting, very
was
interesting,
the sins of the father.
Yeah.
And how do we break the intergenerational curse? And recently, a New Yorker profile was written about what we do by Elif Batuman, the Turkish-American writer. And I was so excited to see that she zeroed in on early childhood trauma being the intergenerational curse that we unwittingly passed from generation to generation without even knowing it. Not even remembering when we incurred it as children, and not even knowing how it impacts how we act as parents and how we pass it on to children afterwards. Because like Oedipus, we can't be conscious of when our feet were pierced. We can't actually remember that moment. All we have is the scars. And so that's what audiences in incarcerated settings want to talk about, the sins of the father. They also wanted to talk about road rage and how a single decision, a single bad decision can erase all the good that a person can have done in the world in the eyes of a community. We also, and we're running out of time, but we also work with a group called Cure Violence, which is a bunch of gang affiliated, it's an organization that has been, before it even became an organization, was doing this incredible work in low-income communities where there was a lot of violence, where they apply social pressure. Formerly gang-affiliated people who are called credible messengers go out into the community and they put their bodies on the line when they hear that violence is about to erupt. And we have several of them who are called credible messengers, who are facilitators for theater of war productions. Their entire model looks at violence as a public health epidemic and sees no difference between victim and perpetrator. And when one steps back from seeing the binaries of victim and perpetrator and sees intergenerational violence and early childhood trauma and poverty and the school to prison pipeline and systems of oppression as contributing, and the pandemic and the disproportionate impact it's having on Black and brown communities, one sees violence in a different context. And so intergenerational curses are very germane to the conversations we're trying to have about violence interruption. Yeah. But these credible messengers are the teachers, because they are so deep in the trenches of trying to break the cycle.
Thank you.
So, yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Jay Colleran, I don't have your first name, but I think you're going to be our last person tonight. No pressure to say something brilliant or sum everything up into a perfect statement. But, we can't hear you. Oh, there you go.
Okay, anyway. So I've been so excited and interested in hearing everything. I wrote a book called Theater and War, and I've been interested all of my scholarly life on politics and theater and the way humanities intervene, starting in South Africa. And I'm sure that the work of someone named Lara Foote Newton might be familiar to you.
Yes, I've heard that name, yeah.
Yeah, as she takes compendious novels and makes them into fairly interactive theater pieces that are so deeply moving. For example, in one of the novels, Ways of Dying by Zakes Mada, a character cannot find the other shoe to her dead baby's shoe. And in this site-specific work, there's just piles and piles of children's shoes around us, And then the Handspring, William Kentridge, they did War Horse, but they did so many more interesting things. And I think the very first thing that I saw that moved me to being interested in the efficaciousness of theater was John Canny in Sizwe Bansi is Dead, because he spoke extemporaneously about his personal experiences in the Ford factory. So I say all that to say that when I I'm sorry to admit I'm fairly new to your work. When someone, and my daughter went to Kenyon and told me about this, and I began to read about what you're doing, it seems to me that your capacity to draw so widely on so many interesting and metacognitive, Brechtian, all sorts of political devices that force us spectators to act is truly, truly extraordinary. And I just want to say that as a newly converted plan, I hope you don't think you're going to be stalked if I keep showing up in a little box. Because I'd really like, I plan to see Antigone and Ferguson. I'd
Please.
like to see more of your work. And are you actually in Gambier, or are you?
Would that I were. There's so many
Okay.
people who would like to visit, including, well, there's some people who are no longer there, but there are so many people I'd like to visit, and so many friends and even fellow classmates who are still there, Sarah Height and Bill McCullough, my teacher,
Oh yeah.
and Pat, and
I ran into Bill in the post office today, so I told him about this.
oh, good.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to call him tomorrow. I send him the recording if he doesn't watch, but I'll send him the recording. Just briefly, for those of you who are watching, because we're at the end of our time, and just to speak to that, and thank you so much for what you said. We have over six or seven public performances coming up in the month of October alone. The two axes that we're operating on are racialized police violence and social justice, and the intersection of that with health inequality, which during the pandemic, which from our perspective are the two most important issues of the present month leading up to the election, and they are a double pandemic from our perspective, and until we see them as such, and the sort of police violence and inequity being pandemics that preceded the current one, we will never heal. And so we have Antigone and Ferguson on October 2nd coming up. That's open to the public. We have October 8th, which is for the Ohio 5, and we have Antigone and Ferguson on October 17th, open to the public, and also focusing on the Baltimore community. We also have our Theater of War.
What is the Ohio 5?
The 5 liberal arts colleges, of which Kenyon is one, Oberlin is another, Denison, et cetera.
Yeah.
Worcester. On October 7, we'll be performing for Doctors Without Borders, our project on frontline medical providers, with plays by Sophocles, Philologist and Women of Trachis, with Frances McDormand and Frankie Faison leading the cast. On October 14th, we'll be doing our King Lear project for the until recently largest nursing home in North America as the center of the, and then at the end of the month, we'll be performing for Queen's Hospital. We don't usually have months this busy, especially on Zoom. It's a whole new thing for us, but we welcome all of you to come, not just to the Kenyon performances, but to our other public performances. They're all free. And the only way to say this is that, you know, we have a large following of people who raise their hands. This is my 12th performance, because the reality is it's different every time. Because the real performance is the discussion, when people stand up and they take the risk of being present with each other and speaking their truths. And so you can come to the next 300 performances, and each will be, in like Kierkegaardian terms, it will never be a repetition, because they're radically different based on who is in the room and what's at stake. So we welcome you all to come to all those performances. I also just want to tie together as we close several of the things that were said on the screen. Alexia brought up a performance we did at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, and Yang brought up Simone Weil's work, which I've been reading this last week, because one of the things sometimes I get accused of is, aren't you just colluding with the military? Which again is another form of victim blaming from my perspective. You know, don't you feel gross taking money from the Department of Defense? And I say, well, you mean taxpayer money? Because of course the oil money of the foundations that support your work is far cleaner. But needless to say, this idea that military audiences, by engaging with people in the trenches who may be carrying out things that we don't agree with, we find repugnant, that if we distance ourselves from them, if we turn a blind eye to what they're doing, that we're not responsible ethically for what they are doing. Well, that's the opposite of our position. And what Simone Weil puts forth is something that I've learned from our work, which is, and this I'm sure in your work on theater and war, you've seen over and over and over again, which is that if you're looking for a condemnation of war, if you're looking for the most chilling and unforgettable, damning condemnation of war and inglorious description of what it actually entails, far more powerful than those of us, I presume, who consider ourselves on the left, shouting our moral superiority at those who've served. Far more effective is creating forums where those who've experienced war or gone to war or been on the receiving ends of our wars can speak the truth of their experiences. I think the Greeks were doing that. And any opportunity we can do that, I think, like Simone Weil puts forth in her essay that you referenced, Yang, is the most pacifistic thing that can be done. It is a rebuke at the end of the day of the glory of war if we get inside these stories and we hear people's truths. And at that performance at Oregon Shakespeare Festival, and I'll close with saying this, something really powerful happened, and it's germane to, I think, the conversations that are going to come out of this residency, and that is, I always wondered what civilians should do when they're in a space or a performance with people who really are right up against the issues we're trying to address, like veterans. And was it just to listen, to bear witness? And it turns out there's a woman who was there that night in Oregon who sort of showed the way. She had heard a number of other veterans in the room narrate their own moral distress at having done things that haunted them, ordering missile strikes and killing children unwittingly, doing things that went against the grain of their own moral compass, not being able to stop something from happening that haunts them at night, having felt complicit in the suffering and violence of innocent people. And at the end of the performance, I always say, well, does someone have something to say that wasn't addressed by one of my extremely leading questions? And this woman raised her hand and she said, I have something to say. I'm a civilian, and I am a doctor in this community, and I don't know anyone in the military, and I am on the left, and I am against war. And I have had patients come to my practice complaining of issues that only can be mental issues that had derived from their war experiences, and I have actively ignored their suffering and not treated them for fear that by helping them, I would be aiding the war effort. And then she broke down in tears in front of these men, and she said, I will promise I will never do this again. And I know how wrong I was to have done this. I think what was so powerful about that moment for me was it answered the question, what is our responsibility? It's not simply to bear witness. It's not simply to consume the stories of people who've suffered trauma. It's actually to meet people in their own moral discomfort and acknowledge where we have erred morally. And take risks. I mean, that woman talked about committing malpractice openly in a public setting. And the veterans who heard her do that surrounded her afterwards and said, thank you so much. I heard one say, that's so much better than thank you for your service. And I think that's what it's incumbent upon us to realize, that we have to get down into the mess, because the blood was already on our hands. It was always on our hands. I mean, maybe you live off the grid, but you're not doing Zoom if you live off the grid. So, if you don't live off the grid, the blood is on your hands. So it's with that, I know we could talk for hours. We're 7 minutes past our time. I just want to say there's a survey at the end of this. It's a survey from Theater of War Productions to you, the audience that's convened. We'll be posting this tomorrow so people can watch it. We hope you'll follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Theater of War, the American way with an ER. But the survey at the end just registers whether you want to get involved with our residency. Anyone can get involved. Everyone can get involved. And it sort of lays out some of the things that people in the Kenyon community can sort of express their interest to do. We want to hear from you now. We'll hear from you after Antigone, and then we're going to roll up our sleeves during the intercession, and we're going to create a project with Kenyon. That will then incubate in Gambier virtually and then take out across the world. So with that, I just want to thank you all so much for participating and being part of this exchange. It's really such a pleasure and honor to meet you. I wish we could all be in person in Gambier and having this conversation and go to the inn afterwards and have a hot toddy or something. But needless to say, this is as good as it gets. We've got Zoom. And I don't think it's a miracle that should be disparaged. It's an amazing technology. It's been an absolute pleasure being with you all tonight. Thank you again for your attention. and for engaging with me. I hope to see you again at our next event very soon. Okay, take care.